My name is Ed Weber, and I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service here at Washington State University. And today's lecture is part of a series that is now in its fourth year. The series title is Science, Technology, Environment, and Democracy. And we are very excited about hosting Charles Perrow as part of this long-running series.
I appreciate that, and if we have just a moment for a commercial, that's the cover of the new book, and it should be out middle of next month. And this new book has a very simple message. It argues that disasters from natural sources, industrial and technological sources, and deliberate sources, such as terrorism, are inevitable and they are increasing. Now, we can prevent some of these and we can mitigate the effects of some of these, but we're not going to escape them. At present, we focus upon protecting the targets or reducing the damage to the targets or the people involved. But we have neglected the more basic strategy, which I'm going to put forth, of reducing the size of the targets. That is, reducing the concentrations of energy found in hazardous materials, the concentrations of humans in risky locations, and the concentration of power in some of our vital organizations. The argument is that smaller, dispersed targets of nature's wrath, industrial accidents, or the terrorist's aim will kill fewer and cause less economic and social disruption. Our organizations and institutions are not capable of preventing natural or man-made disasters, nor can we expect them to mitigate their effects very much. And this is an organizational theorist who is saying this. Spent all my career studying these organizations, and they're not up to the task. Now, the disasters have all increased in the last 30 years or so, and will continue to mount. Our response has been largely one of prevention. Higher levees on the rivers, safety alarms, border controls, the like, and mitigation, such as early warnings, better evacuation, or improving the work of our first responders. We fall far short of perfection on both prevention and mitigation, and always will. It's time, I argue, to look at the targets of nature's wrath, the industrial failures, or the terrorist jihad. Some targets are not reducible, and mitigation is all we can do. For example, we're not going to abandon our cities because they sit on earthquake faults, nor can we do much about meteorites, tsunamis, volcanoes, or tornadoes. Also, the spread of destructive energy from these is so vast, so rapid, and often unpredictable that reducing the size of targets will have little effect. And with pandemics and bioterrorism, it is just too easy for their deadly organisms to spread, for us to do much more than remediation. But these kind of disasters are rare. Most of our disasters are more frequent: hurricanes, floods, explosions, fires, or as with the terrorist attacks on large targets or the internet, these are anticipated in the near future. At present, we are doing little about these that is effective. Take our response to the, sorry, I missed a slide in here, running through the types of catastrophes, natural, unintended, and deliberate. You can see a wide range of them. And some of them we can't do much about, but most of them we will be able to do a lot about. At present, we do little. Take our response to the 9/11 tragedy. It represents the political and organizational problems we face. Our Homeland Security Department got off to a very poor start and has largely fumbled ever since. Congress would not give up any of its fiscal and personnel power of the 88 committees and subcommittees that oversaw the 22 agencies that were moved to the department, forced into the department. Here is a sanitized scheme of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and this is more like it. This is what really goes on. These are the 88 committees and subcommittees getting their teeth into that operation and into the vast amounts of pork that reside there. Tom Ridge and his aides testified, on average, every day and a half of the first year of the department's existence. And the department in that first year had to give 1,300 briefings to Congress. The pork administered by Congress has been tremendous. Senators from small states ensured that a traditional formula was used so that 40% of the money was divided equally among the states, regardless of the threats to the states or even the population of the states. For example, though New York City had been the target for 6 terrorist attacks in the last decade, the state as a whole received only $25 per person as compared to Wyoming, which got $61 per person and has never been attacked. When the White House tried to change the formula to reflect the risk involved, Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont pointed out that the majority of the senators on his committee that would have to approve of the change came from small states like his, Vermont, which got 54 per person. So the White House was unsuccessful in having a more rational allocation of funds. Big chunks of port security money went to private firms for refurbishing their facilities, often in inland states and resort areas in the Caribbean, which faced no security risk at all. When first responders funds finally began flowing, it took 3 years before those funds were finally allocated. They had to be spent on equipment. This benefits business. They couldn't be spent on personnel where it was needed. The benefits for business got so bad that the first Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security went public with some of it, including what he called a $10 million theft by Boeing, and he was fired from his job. Tests of readiness have showed woeful performance. Park police officials in Washington, D.C., to test the readiness, deliberately left a suitcase next to the Washington Monument. They waited, but no policeman responded. Later, it was determined that the responsible policeman was sleeping instead of patrolling, but here's the major point. With no police response, they called the Department of Homeland Security and got this recording from our protectors. Due to the high level of interest in the new department, all of our lines are busy. However, your call is important to us, and we encourage you to call back soon. The company that hires most of the guards for our nuclear power plants also tests their security. To get high ratings, they rig the tests so that everyone knows just what kind of a mock attack will be made and just when it will be made. For some months, it was hard to be sure that the airport security personnel actually plugged in the scanning machines they were standing there and supposed to be watching. Teams testing security, red teams they're called, are able to steal plutonium from government nuclear defense sites that can be used in terrorist bombs, to sneak weapons aboard airplanes, and they still are able to do that, to hide mock bombs in containers that are selected for inspection, and then the mock bombs are never detected, to bring radioactive material that could be used for dirty bombs over the border from Canada. and so on and on. The failures of the DHS and FEMA, especially with FEMA and Katrina, are endless. Now, the most vigorous effort of the White House in connection with the formation of the new department was the largely successful attempt to deunionize personnel in the agencies that would be moved. But one doubts that this contributed to our security. Now, as an organizational theorist, as I said, I'm not surprised by these failings. As we theorists say, organizations are permanently failing, both public and private organizations. So let's not depend upon unreasonably efficient organizations or impossibly effective government. I don't think the Clinton administration, I think the Clinton administration just might have prevented 9/11 because twice it alerted airports, police, and border controls when attacks upon the U.S. were threatened in 1998 and again in 1999. And FEMA, under the Clinton administration, was a model agency. But the Bush administration, as bad as it has been in the disaster area, is not the main reason for our woes. Under the best of government, our organizations are bound to fail. So let's do something about the targets. Take nature's targets. From 1950 to 1999, it's a 50-year period. The annual number of natural disasters declared major by the U.S. government has increased about 4 times, and most of these are weather-related disasters. The weather had not changed much in that period, but the number of people and their dwellings and their workplaces and their toys and expensive cars and so forth in risky areas had gone up. Disasters take fewer lives now because of better warnings and evacuation systems and better emergency medical care. But the economic costs of the disasters did not increase just 4 times, like the annual disaster rate, but 14 times. They cost about $54 billion a year before Katrina. Unfortunately, they are subsidized by federal insurance policies and disaster relief, both of which encourage people to build unsafe structures in warm, lovely, hurricane-washed coast with waterfront views, in the lovely California coast and hillsides, vulnerable to floods, fires, mudslides, and, of course, earthquakes. New Orleans is a gem, or was, but it is a soup bowl 10 feet below the levees. Here it is again. The Red Cross estimated the death toll in New Orleans from a Force 4 hurricane filling the soup bowl would range from 70,000 to 150,000. Now that worst case did not happen with Katrina. The levees were not suddenly topped by a surge where there would be no time to climb up to the attic in your house. But they crumbled slowly in just a few places and thus slowly filled in New Orleans, and so many people could be saved. And they crumbled because of inadequate construction from a large organization, the Army Corps of Engineers. So why wait for nature to deconcentrate areas like New Orleans and take 1,800 people in the process? Withdraw the federal subsidies for insurance and announce that disaster relief will not be provided when laws are violated. New Orleans could well serve its important economic role as the largest port in the nation at 1/3 of its size. And at that size, we could protect it. Or take industrial disasters. Chemical plants like this one sit next to apartment houses, and they blow up occasionally. Their toxic products can leak into city sewers, as this one did in Louisville, Kentucky, destroying 4 city blocks, which took over 2 years to rebuild. Our chemical industry is highly concentrated, and that concentrates hazardous materials. Here is a disaster that filled 1,800 homes with oil in the Katrina disaster, rendering them total losses because of the concentrated storage in the city of New Orleans. Didn't have to be there. Their tanks were not properly secured by the company. Now, even more oil spilled from these, but they were not in a residential area, so there was no serious damage to private property. There are 123 locations in our nation where a vapor cloud released by an accident or by an attack by a terrorist could endanger over 1 million people. 123 locations. The economic advantage of these scale economies are small compared to the risks they pose. The government should mandate the use of safer substances and smaller and more dispersed storage facilities and prohibit large storage in urban areas. We were lucky with the World Trade Center. There were huge quantities of diesel fuel in the basement that came very close to ignition. The fuel could be brought in a little at a time as it is needed. The economies of large storage in the midst of millions of people are tiny, but the risks of that are huge. The chemical industry, the larger the plant and the larger the firm, the greater the toxic releases. Big is not safer nor easier to regulate. Concentration in the railroad industry is associated with an increase in accidents, some involving toxic substances in populated areas. Concentration in the electric power industry, following the deregulation of that industry in the 1990s, can be tied to the giant Northeast blackout of 2003, and certainly to the power shortages and huge cost increases that California, Oregon, Washington, and Vancouver experienced in 2001 and 2002. We are simply eating away at our critical infrastructure in these cases and be presenting larger targets for storms, industrial accidents, and terrorists. A final industrial concentration is less obvious. A key part of our critical infrastructure is now the internet. At present, the net is highly deconcentrated, the world's largest system. But forces are endangering that deconcentration, and this will reduce its security. In addition, with only one operating system on 95% of the desktop computers, Microsoft's Windows, Microsoft had not had to pay much attention to reliability or to security. It did not have to compete with other operating systems that offered more reliability or more security because 95% of them were running on its platform. That was okay when it was a standalone operation, home computers, small businesses, and so forth. But once this was connected with the worldwide internet, everything became interconnected, and the unreliability of a workstation in a bank, now connected to vast financial markets, spread, as did the consequences of security breaches in this industry. Software failures are responsible for very few deaths to date, but increasingly, software is linked to systems with catastrophic potential. In the case of failures on the part of operators or designs or terrorist attacks. Now, of course, most software failures in our critical infrastructure to date, anyway, are not due to Microsoft, but no accounting has been made of their corporate source. With only 10% of the software market dwarfed by something called SAP and an IBM system, CDIC, dwarfed by these, it would appear to be a small player in the huge software industry. But the Windows operating system is so ubiquitous that over half of the SAP's customers, and that's 90% of the Fortune 500 firms, along with many others, over half of the customers use SAP equipment with Microsoft products, such as Windows. And thus, using Windows, it can bring any unreliability or lack of security into these systems. Windows-based software plays a critical role in our financial structure, our nuclear power plants, our industry control systems, SCADA systems are called, Defense Department data banks, the FBI, the CIA, military weapons and fighting platforms such as aircraft, tanks, and ships. There is a program, Windows for Warships, and appears to be used to some extent in almost everything that can kill. Heart pumps, infusion pumps, pacemakers, medication distribution in hospitals, and now even the safety of our most widely used weapon, the automobile. A good part of the problem with software reliability stems then from the success and thus the concentrated power of Microsoft. It is embedded in all of our critical infrastructures. It is improving its reliability and security, to be sure. But if you believe in capitalism, if you believe that capitalism really works, we need a market for capitalism to work. We need several viable operating systems and necessary software that will compete on the basis of reliability and security, where lives and economic damage, vast economic damage, are at stake. Concentration in the telecommunications industry is now occurring in the previously highly deconcentrated area of the internet servers, or the backbones of the net. Not only will your freedom to surf be restricted by this concentration, but with server concentration, the targets for hackers, thieves, and terrorists are larger and more consequential. And firewalls are harder to construct, so there's a real disaster component to the internet. A recent U.S. Interstate Commerce Commission ruling defined cable internet access as an information service rather than as telecommunications. And this exempted it from the requirement to act as a common carrier, which is the case with telecommunications companies. And since they didn't have to be common carriers, this allowed increased concentration in that industry. What can be done about reducing vulnerabilities that come from economic concentration or fail to conform to the regulations in that area? But every time this has happened, they have backed off when the flood or the hurricane actually came, and this is true of Katrina too. There is so much political pressure, they back off. This could be corrected. We do not have to encourage people to settle in these areas. More important, we have precedents for reducing or preventing concentrated economic power, and thus for a precedent for deconcentrating organizations. 30 years ago, we had effective antitrust legislation. It could be reinstated. A federal judge tried to break up Microsoft. It was actually a faulty proposal, I think. I wasn't that much in favor of it. But we could try again with a better proposal. Or in the trivial case of Intuit's Quicken, that's a software company, the Department of Justice forestalled a Microsoft takeover of the highly successful company. But that is on a trivial matter, and a home accounting system. What about SCADA systems that run our power plants? The government could be more effective if, like the state of Massachusetts, It required open source operating systems. That just started in Massachusetts, and it's really a headache for Microsoft. We could once again regulate the internet as a common carrier, allowing free access, which would limit concentration in that area and thus limit the vulnerability to hackers, accidents, or terrorists. The second problem with reducing economic concentration is the familiar argument of economies of scale. Big organizations are more efficient, it is argued by economists. But the scales we have now in the vulnerable parts of our critical infrastructure are well beyond any reasonable size required for efficiency of production efficiencies. The large sizes we have are there to achieve market control and political influence, not production efficiencies. For example, most processes involving hazardous materials would still be productively efficient at greatly reduced scales, and this would concentrate fewer hazmats. Now, we're bound to have large systems in our highly interconnected nation, but we do not necessarily need them to be dominated by large organizations. You can have large systems without large organizations dominating them. A system made up of many rather than a few organizations has more resiliency and more redundancy. While we think of our nation and its economy as highly interdependent, most of the relationships are ones of dependency, and many lack safeguards of redundancy. A city in a risky area needs multiple redundant evacuation routes and multiple redundant means of protection, medical and other emergency services. If we rely upon only a few, the inevitable failure of some of these will put us in peril. It is similar with our crucial electric power system in the United States. We had more reliability before deregulation allowed the concentration of power producers. The internet has been incredibly reliable because it is designed to have multiple redundant pathways between the nodes, the billions of nodes. This reliability is now threatened as internet service providers are consolidating, making them more vulnerable to accidents, hackers, and terrorists, as well as threatening the freedom of access by users. The urge to consolidate and concentrate critical functions in large organizations increases our vulnerability. We can have large systems, as we must, without large organizations. The electric power grid and the internet, now in dangers, were good examples of deconcentrated large systems. I want to mention just briefly two other examples of deconcentrated large systems that are remarkably efficient and remarkably reliable. One of these are small firms, and the second, alas, are terrorist networks. Though these four systems are highly interconnected, the relationships between the nodes of these networks are predominantly ones of interdependency, that is, reciprocity, rather than dependencies, that is, authority. More of our critical infrastructure could be configured in this way. When you get reciprocal relations, these involve self-adjusting devices and the possibility of self-organization of these nodes or parts of the modules of the system. Increasingly, the reliability of the power grid depends upon so-called intelligent agents, relays and circuit breakers that read incoming signals and make adjustments automatically and send signals for other nodes to make their adjustments to the conditions of the grid. The U.S. government, however, does not demand this investment by the highly profitable electric power industry, and they could well afford it. It's immensely profitable. The internet has electronic agents that search for the best links between nodes. Similar example of reciprocity. The reciprocity in networks of small firms is more prosaic, but it offers even more lessons for organizations in our critical infrastructure. These small firm networks exist in northern Italy, Scandinavian countries, in Japan, machine tool industry, for example, and other industries, some parts of Silicon Valley, and the network of biotech firms in the US. I want to make an important point here. Small firms by themselves are not valuable if they are not networked. If they're just by themselves, they are classic examples of high dependency. Dependency either upon a large firm as a supplier to an apparel company, or a very local market. The reciprocity in networks of small firms involves sharing of information, sharing technologies, sharing market opportunities in the interest of the common good, even while the individual firms compete fiercely. Knowledge is shared as employees move between firms and as the prospects of individual firms rise and fall. If one firm goes down, you don't even have to change your carpool because there's another one close by that you can join. The firms in an industry, machine tools, textiles, consumer goods, packaging machines, and so forth, support trade schools and transportation infrastructure in the local area. The communities where they are located are prosperous and liberal. No single firm dominates. Unfortunately, these kinds of structures are being challenged by mass marketers and concentrated producers in the global economy, but that could be prevented. Terrorist networks, finally, have extensive ties between the cells, sharing information and expertise. A study of the Madrid railroad train bombing disclosed dozens of cells in a variety of nations that cooperated in the endeavor. So taking out any single cell would have had little effect upon this resilient network. Summarizing these four examples in terms of size, reliability, and efficiency, and their organizational control structure, offers an instructive alternative system design to those we have in the U.S., upon which we depend for our protection from our three disasters forces. Internet, largest organization in the world, power grid, largest machine. Even terrorist networks will have from 10 to hundreds of cells in them. The reliability is extremely high to date in the internet, has been very high in the power grid. It's moderate to self-adjusting in small firm networks because they're vulnerable to very large suppliers. And considering the attack the terrorist networks are under, I think their reliability is amazingly high. I put it as moderate here, but how many have we eliminated? None. System efficiency, extremely high given the volume in the internet, very high in the power grid. And in small firm networks, economies of scale transform into network economies of scale. You don't need one firm to realize economies of scale, but a network of firms. And terrorists, finally, very high efficiency, low maintenance costs, low operating costs. And here's the most important point for me as an organizational theory. The control structure of these deconcentrated systems is amazing because the top doesn't give orders. It doesn't direct. It sets goals. It coordinates and monitors. It does not command and control. The second level of these is involved, it's complicated, but spatial and product devolution of whatever the network is concerned with. Third is support staff, say, public relations with a terrorist network, financing with a terrorist network, communications with a terrorist network. You need skilled people in these organizations, but that third level is pretty small. And the bottom level has very high autonomy in all four of the cases and is self-adjusting and certainly is the largest of them. In contrast to these four, most organizations on our critical infrastructure are centralized, bureaucratic, difficult to change, and the commercial ones seek to maximize profit through market control and incidentally achieve higher prices for consumers, as with electric power and what's happening in telecommunication. In the matter of concentration of hazardous materials that are vulnerable to our three sources of disaster, it's clear that the large firms concentrate more hazmats, and research shows that the large firms in the chemical and the oil sectors have more accidents and pollute more than smaller firms. Just to say it once more, big is not safer. Legislation regarding liability is needed. Damages from chemical disaster are not charged to the companies, but absorbed by communities. Fines for violating regulations are trivial. With realistic liability claims, there would be a strong incentive to deconcentrate storage of hazmats, deconcentrate production, and use safer materials and process. And even without antitrust legislation, we could get that with liability insurance. Unfortunately, the U.S. is at present not in a place to encourage any of this. Lacking campaign financing controls, which I think is the root of the evil at present, Congress is beholden to the large donors. They need it for television advertising, and the large donors are the ones that can pay for that. And the large donors are the corporations. And so is the presidency, upon which Congress shapes the judicial system that increasingly favors private interest and rules, for example, that states cannot pass environmental laws that are stronger than the federal environmental laws. And these are weak already and are withering. The mass media is controlled by a small number of huge for-profit corporations, so hope for a concerned, informed electorate are dimmer by the year. Now, when I started studying small firm networks some 15 years ago, I had the only nocturnal emission I have had in connection with capitalism. Here was the alternative to the multi-divisional firm. It was more likely to represent community rather than self-interest. But unfortunately, the hard wiring of our instincts as a result of thousands of years of evolutionary adaptation presents a constant threat to the idea of community rather than self-interest. Both of them are there. Both community and self-interest are in our makeup, or we would not have survived. We needed both. But particularly with the growing abundance and prosperity of the U.S. since World War II, community seems less urgent and self-interest gets a bigger play. It is very seductive, but it must be restrained in view of the increasing threat of major disasters. At present, we are no better off than the Department of Homeland Security and can only keep our fingers crossed. Thank you.
I'd like to please encourage you to start the rebuttals and/or questions, comments, whatever you have.
My name is Matt Carroll from Natural Resource Sciences here on campus, but I'm a fellow sociologist, and I'm no longer young, but I can say to you, sir, that I've been reading your work since graduate school. My own work these days is largely in forest fires, and I would like to add a corollary. I agree completely with your argument here today. I'd like to add a corollary, and that is what I'm seeing particularly in terms of communities that are vulnerable to forest fires is a need for a move away from clientism towards civic engagement. In other words, it used to be we could let Smokey the Bear protect our communities. Now we need to recognize the need for us to take our own actions at the community level and get people involved in actually defending their own communities against these threats. And I think the movement away from clientism towards civic engagement goes along with organizational devolution as you're describing it today.
Absolutely. I really second that. And I actually did some work for the Forest Service on disaster management. And I kept saying, do you ever try to involve the vulnerable communities in your prevention system? Do you ever try to get them to put safety measures in place and warn them where there's likely to be a flash up like the Man Gulch fire or something like that? And that was a totally novel and rejected idea. But that was maybe 10 years ago. So maybe it's changed. I hope it has.
Dr. Perrow, the question I would have is I study environmental policy. And as you well know, one of the strong movements within environmental policy is against urban sprawl. As I hear you talking about trying to devolve and trying to, rework the kinds of giant systems we have, it seems to fly in the face and it seems to encourage urban sprawl. I mean, how would you respond to that? Because what I'm sensing is that we're going to make these things sprawl a bit more in order to be safer and so on. How would you respond to that?
That's a very good question. That's a tough decision. But remember, I said at the beginning, there's certain kinds of things that we can't do anything about. And this is one of them. We're not going to move off of earthquake faults, but we could build better structures there, or not build them in the worst areas. They're currently filling in San Francisco Bay, which is just a mud flat. They're filling it in with mud and then building high rises on it. The next time there's an earthquake, it'll happen like it did in the 1906 earthquake. At that time, buildings that were down on Market Street literally sank 4 stories, just straight down like that with the earthquake, because there's nothing under it. But in terms of urban sprawl, I would like small concentrations dispersed in terms of natural disasters. If you make an urban sprawl that you're talking about, you're going to increase the fire hazard. You're going to increase the wind damage hazard, and certainly the floodplain hazard of those kinds of things. So there's very specific cases where you would be against that. Then if you cluster communities, you get a better communication system within the community. Suppose there's a natural gas explosion. Has nothing to do with concentration of hazardous materials, but we use gas in our cities, and there's an explosion. You might say, isn't that going to endanger more people if they are clumped together than spread out? Possibly so, but the biggest problems that we have with those kinds of disasters in suburbs is the lack of communication and lack of sharing and helping with one another. One of the reasons why 9/11 wasn't immensely worse was because it was densely concentrated, so the real first responders, not the firemen and the police, but the neighbor, the person on the street, the shop owner who knew where people lived and so forth, those responders performed brilliantly. If you spread them out, they're not going to do so well. It's an imperfect answer to a real conundrum.
My name is Stephen Steer, political science here at Washington State University. I completely agree, as someone who studied Homeland Security and coordination issues related to Homeland Security, that we're spending far too much time and effort on trying to stop terrorism and far too little on resilience, which could build capacity to deal with all sorts of hazards that you talk about. But I also think about the danger of turning your message into another set of proverbs. The reason I say that is organization theory is best known for having a lot of bromides that are true, but we just don't know exactly when they're true. And so my question is, and as I was also thinking, one of the lessons of the 9/11 Commission report was the total breakdown of our intelligence gathering and dissemination. And there it seems we had a situation where we had a large number of units, or small units in a large system, but the results certainly didn't turn out so well. So how can we identify the conditions under which your lessons apply, and are there any conditions where they don't apply?
Okay, another good one. First, the 9/11 problem. Let me remind you that in 1998 and 1999, on two occasions, the intelligence community got warning that there might be strikes, and at both occasions there were. The first one was there were strikes abroad. The second one, there were strikes abroad, and one attempted, one at home. The FBI and the CIA dots were connected at that time, at least to a limited extent. At that time, they shared information, and they shared it without being put under a big umbrella of a new directorate of intelligence, which was supposed to bring them together. The reason why they didn't share dots in 2001 is much more simple. They sent out warnings, but the White House would not listen. They asked for, and even before 9/11, they asked for more resources because they were getting increasing information, which they shared with each other, that there was a domestic threat. And so the FBI asked for more resources, and so did the CIA in this respect. Both of them were turned down flatly. As a matter of fact, they were turned down a month after 9/11. Cheney would not allow an increase. He just vetoed it. So we have a problem here at the very top that has little to do with the structure of the organizations underneath it. If you're not paying attention, if you think that there is no real threat from bin Laden or other terrorist groups, then you won't tell people to pay attention. Clinton told people to pay attention. And I think if the same attack, 9/11, had been carried out under the 1999, it well could have been prevented, because over half of those hijackers were, in a sense, apprehended at the airports. Over half of them were inspected, were patted down. Or no, they weren't patted down. Their luggage was inspected. That was all. If that had happened with the 9/11 terrorists, we probably would have stopped any one of them, and stopping any one of them would have broken the coordination of those attacks. They also could have been, if people had been alerted by the White House saying something was imminent, then the air traffic controllers, when the first word of a hijacking occurred, they are supposed to stop all takeoffs. But they didn't, because they weren't thinking in terms of a massive kind of thing. They thought they had a hijacking, but they didn't think about shutting down all other takeoffs. If they'd done that, there would have been only one plane instead of four doing this, or three of them doing the damage, and the fourth one attempting to do that. So I'm talking about something that has to happen at the very top. Now, below that, I have a lot of suggestions for how to get the better coordination among the intelligence agencies, and none of them have show up in the current reorganization. Our instinctual response, Congress and the public alike, is if something's going wrong, bring them together, centralize it. Create a Department of Homeland Security. and get all 22 of these agencies to cooperate. Well, they don't. It's made things, in many respects, less safe in critical areas. But thanks for your comments.
I want to say, open with a premise and then build some questions around the premise. The premise is, at any given point in time, our intellectual energy is a hydraulic process. There's a certain amount of intellectual and policy attention we can give to any particular issue at any particular point in time. So if we choose to emphasize one thing, that means something else is going to be sacrificed.
It's a scary world because the terrorists have finally glommed onto the fact that chlorine gas is a very effective weapon. And they're doing it in Iraq. But they're only doing tanks of 350 gallons. And they killed only 7 or 8 people and wound about 50 with those. Why it took them so long, why it's taking them so long to think about 90 tons of chlorine gas in a rail car that's parked 4 blocks from the White House, that is vulnerable to a satchel bomb. It really surprises me. Regarding the number of hurricanes and the force of the hurricanes in that 50 years period was what I was talking about. The weather hadn't changed that much. Now it's heated up for, we're not sure of the reasons, it's probably global warming. It's heated up since 1999, and we have more of these and we can expect more. So you're absolutely right that in that respect, things are changing and making it more hazardous for us. And I just say I have to ignore global warming in this book. I'm much more concerned with these immediate things right now. Well, in many respects, I'm much more concerned with global warming. And when the global warming and civilization collapse, I just left it out of this litany of disasters. We can go about paying attention to global warming and do what I'm talking about, deconcentrate the targets that make us so vulnerable.
I'm Christine Horn. I'm in the sociology department. So I'm convinced by your argument that concentration and bigness is a problem, and that when breakdowns occur, they're going to be more problematic in something big than something small. So then, as I'm listening to you, I find it sort of depressing because I'm thinking, well, what's the solution? And you suggest that government could regulate, and that could be part of the solution, except that government really isn't doing it. And as I think about what you're saying, it seems to me that the same argument that you make about concentration of industry or anything else also applies to government. We've got to assume that government's going to screw up. Maybe a president's going to be good, but maybe a president's going to screw up, and when they do, the consequences are terrible. So is an implication of, I guess my question is, what's the solution? One solution might be that we really want government to break up. We want to spread out government so that it's smaller, so when President Bush makes a mistake, it's not so catastrophic. Yeah. But that seems potentially problematic. So if breaking up government's not the solution, why would government be different from these other kinds of concentrated bureaucracies? And if it's not the solution, then what might be the solution?
There's a big difference between government and private organizations. We elect government officials. It's a very imperfect system. We elect a few people who then appoint a bunch of people, but there is a sense of electoral responsibility that goes with government, and every 2 years, or in the case of the presidency, every 4 years, you have a chance to register a big complaint about the way things are going. We do not elect the presidents of General Motors and Microsoft or the big railroad companies or the chemical companies. We have no say over those leaders. That's a vast difference. It would be very different if workers could elect the president of DuPont or BP is a better one, because the workers have complained for years about the lack of safety in the BP plants in Texas that killed 17 people or something recently, poisoned a lot of land. And the workers complained about the lack of maintenance and safety in the oil pipelines in Canada that BP did not maintain, and so we had the biggest spill in Canadian history from that. Those people are concerned about having those organizations run well, but they have no say in those organizations. They have no say in those organizations. We have some say, as imperfect and slow as it may be in democratic assemblies and in government. As to the second part of the question, yes, parts of our government are too big and parts of our government are too small. And we really have an imbalance. We have cut the size of the Environmental Protection Agency. We have cut the size of the Justice Department, people who do the investigations. We have cut IRS personnel that investigate tax fraud by big corporations. All of those are cuts in government that I think should be restored, should be changed. There are other parts of government that are just swollen bureaucracies, and people get away with murder. The Smithsonian Institute engaged in a scandal now because the head of the Smithsonian Institute was living high off the hog with government funds, and that just goes on continually. So you watch those. You have a free press which investigates those. You have web blogs. Now we get much more investigation because of the internet, fortunately, because you can still freely ask AOL to let you look at this blog or that blog. But watch out, AOL may turn off this or that blog pretty soon if that blog is pretty critical of you. So there's chances for decreasing size of government. There is bloated, there always will be. That's not a disaster in waiting. That doesn't really concern me that much. We will always have those efficiencies. But the ones I've been talking about, they really scare the hell out of me, and I hope some of you. Thank you very much for your attention and your good questions.
Thank you.